There's a face that appears in certain parts of Ireland that has puzzled outsiders for centuries. You will find it along the western coastline, in the villages of Kerry and Galway and Cork, in communities tucked between stone walls and Atlantic cliffs. Jet black hair, skin so pale it seems almost translucent, eyes that carry the color of shallow seawater. It is a combination that does not match what most people expect when they picture someone Irish, and for generations, nobody could agree on where it came from. People reached for explanations the way they always do when something does not fit the expected pattern. They invented stories, romantic, dramatic, convenient stories that explained the face by pointing at some outside force that must have passed through and left its mark. The stories spread. They got repeated in pubs and written into local histories and passed down through families as quiet certainties. And every single one of them turned out to be wrong. The DNA has now been read, not partially, not speculatively, but comprehensively, across large population samples using modern genomic analysis that can go into the bones of people buried 4,000 years ago and read the same record that is sitting in the cells of their living descendants today. What the science found does not simply update the old stories. It replaces them entirely with something older and more interesting than any of them ever were. The most popular explanation, and the one that has stuck longest in popular imagination, centers on a single catastrophic event in the late 16th century. In 1588, the Spanish Armada, the most powerful naval fleet assembled in that era, launched against England, was devastated by storms and English resistance, and scattered its wreckage across the coastlines of Scotland and Ireland. Dozens of ships went down along the Irish coast. Survivors came ashore. They were dark-haired, olive-skinned, visibly different from the local population. The story practically wrote itself. They stayed. They married into local families. Their children carried the darkness of southern Europe into the Irish gene pool. And somewhere in those children and grandchildren, the Black Irish were born. It is the kind of story that feels true because it is specific enough to seem plausible. A named event, a real historical disaster, a clear mechanism. The problem is that when modern genetics went looking for the signal that story predicts, it was not there. No measurable Spanish genetic influence traceable to the Armada's survivors appears in the Irish population data. The reason is simple arithmetic. A few dozen survivors scattered along hundreds of miles of coastline cannot move the needle on a national gene pool. The math was never on the story side. Romance was never the problem. Scale was. The Viking theory carries more actual genetic support, which makes it more interesting to examine and more instructive when it still fails to explain the thing it is supposed to explain. Norse raiders struck Ireland hard across the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries. They founded Dublin. They settled the eastern coastal towns. Genetic surveys of the modern Irish population do confirm a real, measurable Scandinavian component in Irish male lineages, concentrated in the Y chromosome, which passes from father to son and preserves the signal of migrations and conquests across many generations. That signal is real, but it is concentrated in the east, in the cities and coastal settlements that the Vikings actually built and occupied. The Black Irish face is not concentrated in the east. It appears most consistently in Kerry, in Cork, in Galway, in the west, the places the Vikings barely touched. The genetic signal that should explain the western face is precisely absent from the region where that face is most visible. A theory that points in the opposite geographical direction from the thing it is supposed to explain is not a theory that survives scrutiny. The Norman conquest of the 12th century leaves an even shallower imprint. Norman ancestry in Ireland is largely confined to the eastern half of the island and concentrated in aristocratic lineages traceable through a specific set of surnames. It never penetrated the Western communities deeply enough to leave a population-wide genetic mark. The Normans explained certain things about certain families in certain parts of Ireland. They explain nothing about the face on the Atlantic coast. All of these stories share the same fundamental flaw. They look at a feature of the modern Irish population and reach for the nearest recent historical event that might explain it. They are thinking on the wrong scale of time. To find the actual answer, you have to leave the medieval world entirely and go back much further into a period so remote that it predates not just Viking raids and Spanish shipwrecks, but the entire recorded history of the island. To understand what is actually happening genetically in the west of Ireland, you have to go back to roughly 2500 BCE. At that point, Ireland was inhabited by a population descended from early European farmers who had migrated northward from the Mediterranean region thousands of years earlier. These people had been on the island long enough to build stone monuments, establish farming communities, and develop a continuous cultural tradition with its own distinct genetic signature. They carried, among other things, the pigmentation genes associated with darker hair, a legacy of their southern European ancestry. Then something happened. A culture called the Bell Beaker people, named for the distinctive pottery shape they carried across Europe, began arriving in Britain and Ireland from continental Europe. They brought advanced metalworking. They brought new burial practices. and they brought something more consequential than any of their material culture. They brought different DNA. What followed, based on the ancient genomic evidence, was not gradual assimilation or peaceful blending between two populations. Within a few centuries, the Bell-Beaker migration had replaced the vast majority of the existing population of Britain and Ireland. The exact mechanisms that drove this replacement are still debated among researchers, but the genetic outcome is not debated at all. The Ireland that existed before the Bell-Beaker arrival was demographically erased and rebuilt from a different genetic foundation. The evidence for this is not theoretical. On Rathlin Island, off the northern coast of Ireland, researchers excavated the remains of Bronze Age men who had been buried between approximately 2500 and 2000 BCE. When their DNA was analyzed, they carried a specific paternal lineage marker called R1bL21. That same marker is found in over 65% of Irish men alive today. Those bones did not belong to ancient strangers. They were the direct biological ancestors of the modern Irish population. The Bronze Age people are still here. They are the Irish. The Bell-Beaker arrivals also carried particular genetic variants that spread rapidly through the population. They carried the mutation for lactase persistence, which allows adults to digest milk. In an island where dairy farming became a dietary cornerstone, that variant spread until Ireland developed the highest frequency of lactase persistence of any population on Earth. They also carried variants associated with lighter skin and lighter eye color, which spread as the population grew and generations accumulated. But the genes for dark hair did not disappear. They survived. In certain lineages and certain communities, they did more than survive. They held on with enough frequency to keep appearing in recognizable combinations, generation after generation, in particular regions of the island, right down to the present day. This is where the maternal genetic record becomes essential, because the story of the Bronze Age transformation is primarily a story told by the Y chromosome, the paternal line. The maternal record, preserved in mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child without mixing with the paternal contribution, tells a different and complementary story. Mitochondrial DNA analysis of the Irish population shows a pattern of remarkable continuity in the female line. The most common maternal lineage in Ireland today is one called haplogroup H, found in a substantial proportion of Irish women, with its strongest concentrations in specific subcategories that trace directly back to early European farmers and Bronze Age migrants. Irish mothers have been passing down versions of the same maternal lineage for thousands of years, but older signals are present alongside those dominant lineages. A notable minority of Irish women carry a lineage called haplogroup U, one of the most ancient maternal genetic signatures in Europe. A branch of this called U5 connects living Irish women to the very first modern humans who set foot on the island after the last ice age ended, women who lived along the Irish coastline more than 7,000 years ago, hunting and fishing in a landscape that had only recently emerged from under glacial ice. Their DNA did not disappear. It is still present in the modern population. This matters for understanding the Black Irish specifically, because many of these ancient maternal lineages show their closest modern matches not to Britain or Scandinavia, but to France, to Iberia, to the broader Atlantic coastal zone. These are the genetic echoes of ancient maritime connections, seafaring routes that carried entire family groups into Ireland long before any historically documented migration event. And some of those lineages carried the pigmentation variants that kept dark hair viable in the population, even as lighter traits spread through the paternal contributions of the Bronze Age migrants. Ireland's fathers brought transformation. Ireland's mothers preserved what existed before it. Together, they created the genetic range that makes the full spectrum of Irish appearance possible, from red hair and freckles to jet black hair and pale skin, sometimes within the same family, sometimes in the same set of siblings. The geographic concentration of the Black Irish in the western counties is not accidental. It is the direct result of isolation operating on a gene pool over an extended period of time. The western regions of Ireland were always the hardest to reach and the least penetrated by later waves of settlement and cultural change. The Vikings built their cities in the east. The Normans consolidated power in the east and the Midlands. The Ulster plantation of the 17th century reshaped the north. Wave after wave of later arrivals touched the western coastline last and least. A 2017 research project called the Irish DNA Atlas, led by scientists from the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland and Trinity College Dublin, analyzed individuals whose grandparents all came from the same specific regions of the island. The results dismantled the idea of a single genetically uniform Irish population. Ireland broke into 10 distinct genetic clusters. The most ancient and genetically distinctive clusters were concentrated in the west. Counties like Kerry and Cork showed stronger genetic continuity with Bronze Age Ireland than any other region on the island. While much of the country carries a measurable Norwegian-like ancestry component from the centuries of Viking influence, the western cluster showed significantly less of it. Later arrivals had barely touched them. Those communities remained genetically closer to their Bronze Age ancestors than to their own neighbors in the East. When a small population is cut off from outside genetic influence across enough generations, rare traits do not simply survive. They concentrate. Scientists call this the founder effect. The unusual pigmentation combinations that produced jet black hair alongside pale skin and light eyes had exactly the conditions they needed in the west of Ireland to become a stable and recurring feature of entire communities across centuries. And cultural patterns reinforced what geography protected. The west was the stronghold of the Irish language, of Gaelic music and tradition, of communities that maintained tight internal marriage networks across many generations. Cultural resilience and genetic stability moved in the same direction for a very long time. The biological mechanism underlying all of this sits in a single gene called MC1R. This gene is the primary regulator of hair and skin pigmentation in human beings. Ireland carries the most unusual relationship with MC1R of any population on Earth. Specific variants of this gene are responsible for red hair, and Ireland carries those variants at the highest frequency found anywhere in the world. Roughly 10% of the Irish population has naturally red hair when the global average sits below 2%. The underlying mutations are genuinely that prevalent. But carrying an MC1R variant does not automatically produce red hair. Pigmentation is not a single switch. It is a competition between opposing genetic systems. On one side, melanin production genes push toward darker pigmentation. On the other, MC1R variants weaken the melanin signal. The outcome depends on which system is stronger in any given individual. Someone can carry a red hair variant and still have jet black hair if their melanin production genes are dominant enough to override the MC1R signal entirely. This is not an unusual outcome. It happens across Irish families consistently. One sibling carries hair the color of flames, while another has hair the color of midnight. Same parents, same underlying genetic inheritance, different outcome from the same underlying contest between competing pigmentation systems. The dark pigmentation alleles that drive that darker outcome are not recent imports. Ancient DNA analysis confirms they were present in Ireland during the Neolithic period, carried by Mediterranean-descended farmers thousands of years before the Bronze Age transformation introduced lighter traits into the population. The two systems met and competed across many generations and never fully resolved in favor of either outcome. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 added one final layer to this genetic story. The famine collapsed Ireland's population from roughly 8 million people to approximately 4 million within less than a decade, through death and mass emigration. When half a population disappears that rapidly, the genetic legacy of those who remain becomes amplified. Traits that might have stayed relatively rare instead become more defining features of the surviving community. In the western counties, where isolation had already been concentrating unusual pigmentation combinations across many generations, the famine acted as a final filter on the gene pool. What modern autosomal DNA analysis, which examines the mixed genetic material inherited from both parents, confirmed across large Irish population samples, is a picture of 3 deep ancestral streams contributing to the modern Irish genetic makeup. A substantial portion traces to Western hunter-gatherers who repopulated the island after the Ice Age. Another large portion comes from early European farmers, whose ancestors came from the Mediterranean and whose pigmentation genetics never fully disappeared from the population. The remainder came with the Bronze Age migrants whose arrival reshaped the island's demographic foundation around 2500 BCE. That three-way balance has remained essentially stable for nearly 4,000 years. Very few populations anywhere in Europe can claim that degree of genetic continuity. Later arrivals left their marks, but not evenly and not everywhere. The western counties absorbed almost none of the genetic changes that reshaped the east and north. The oldest genetic layer in Ireland survived most intact there. The Black Irish face is not a mystery. It is not an anomaly. It is not the genetic residue of a shipwreck or the lingering trace of a medieval raid. It is the oldest face on the island, preserved in the West by geography, by cultural isolation, by the particular resilience of communities that maintained their own internal continuity across invasions and famines and everything else that history directed at a small island on the western edge of the European world. The stories were always more comfortable than the truth. A Spanish shipwreck made for a more dramatic explanation than thousands of years of unbroken pigmentation genetics surviving in communities that simply never got diluted enough to lose them. The romantic myths outlasted the evidence for them because nobody had examined the bones carefully enough to replace them with something better. The bones have now been examined. The DNA has been read. And what it says is straightforward. The Black Irish were never foreign. They were never mysterious. They were never the product of some outside force passing through. They are what the oldest surviving genetics of the island looks like, when it has had enough generations of stability to concentrate and become a consistent and recognizable feature of an entire community. The same island that gave the world its redheads kept something older underneath them all along. It was never lost. It never went anywhere. It simply waited in the west of Ireland for long enough that science finally caught up with what was always sitting there in the faces of people who had been looking out at the Atlantic from those cliff tops for 4,000 years. There is one more dimension to this story that most accounts leave out, and it connects the genetic picture to something that is visible not just in faces, but in surnames, in regional naming patterns, in the biology of entire dynasties that shaped Irish history for centuries and left their mark in ways that can now be measured directly. Irish surnames are not simply names, they are biological records. The Gaelic naming system that dominated Ireland before the Norman conquest attached families to specific territories across hundreds of years of continuous habitation. When you carry certain surnames in certain parts of Ireland today, you're carrying a genetic signature that has been passed from father to son through a documented line of descent that in some cases can be traced back over 1,000 years. The Ui Neil dynasty is the most documented example of how this works at a population level. This family claimed political dominance across large portions of northern and western Ireland for centuries, tracing their ancestry to a legendary king whose historical reality is debated, but whose genetic legacy is now measurable. Genetic studies have identified a specific branch of the R1b L21 lineage that appears at elevated frequency across the northwest of Ireland in men carrying surnames historically associated with that dynasty. One family, one genetic signal, still detectable across an entire region more than 1,000 years after the dynasty that created it lost its political power. That region sits directly in the zone most consistently associated with the Black Irish appearance. The same geography that preserved the ancient pigmentation genetics also preserved the ancient patrilineal structures that kept specific genetic combinations alive and concentrated within specific communities across many generations. But the dynasties tell only part of the story. The other part was written not by power but by catastrophe, and the genetics carry that record just as clearly as they carry the record of any ruling family. The Great Famine that struck Ireland between 1845 and 1852 was one of the most severe demographic collapses in modern European history. In less than a decade, the population of the island fell from approximately 8 million people to around 4 million through a combination of starvation and mass immigration. Entire communities disappeared. Villages that had maintained continuous habitation for centuries were emptied in a single generation. The genetic consequence of that collapse was severe and specific. When a large proportion of a population disappears within a short time frame, the genetic diversity of the survivors becomes amplified across the reduced population. Traits that existed at moderate frequencies before the collapse can become more prominent simply because the people who carried alternative traits are no longer there to balance the gene pool. In the western counties, where isolation had already been doing the work of concentrating unusual pigmentation combinations across many previous generations, the famine acted as a final accelerant on a process that had been running for a very long time. The communities that survived in the West were, in genetic terms, the most isolated, the most internally cohesive, and the most continuously rooted in the Bronze Age ancestry that had shaped the Irish population 4,000 years earlier. They came through the famine with their ancient genetics, more concentrated and more visible than they had ever been before. There's another genetic marker worth examining in this context, because it tells the same story from a completely different angle. A mutation called the hemochromatosis variant, which affects iron metabolism, appears at its highest frequency anywhere in the world in the western counties of Ireland. In modern medical contexts, this variant causes a condition where the body absorbs too much iron from food, which can cause serious health problems if untreated. But in historical contexts, particularly during periods of chronic food scarcity and poor nutrition, a tendency toward increased iron absorption likely provided a meaningful survival advantage. The fact that this variant is most concentrated in exactly the same Western communities where the Black Irish appearance is most concentrated is not a coincidence of geography. It reflects the same underlying reality. The people of the western counties of Ireland are the genetic descendants of a specific ancestral population that survived specific historical pressures across a very long period of time. The hemochromatosis mutation and the dark pigmentation alleles are both signatures of the same deep ancestry, concentrated in the same people by the same forces of isolation, selective survival, and genetic continuity. These Western communities were never genetically static. Genetics is never static. Mutations accumulate, lineages shift, rare variants drift in frequency across generations through ordinary biological processes that have nothing to do with migration or conquest. But the baseline, the deep ancestral foundation on which those ordinary processes operate, was preserved in the west of Ireland with a continuity that has almost no parallel in the rest of Western Europe. Most European populations have been layered over and over again by successive migrations, conquests, population replacements, and large-scale demographic movements across the past 4,000 years. The genetic record of most European populations reflects that history of layering. You find Roman-era ancestry, Bronze Age, steppe ancestry, Neolithic farmer ancestry, and Mesolithic hunter-gatherer ancestry all mixed together in proportions that vary by region, but rarely reflect any single ancient source with overwhelming dominance. The Western Irish genetic clusters are different. The Bronze Age ancestry is dominant in a way that it is not in most other European populations. The hunter-gatherer signal is stronger. The more recent migration signals are weaker. The population looks, in genetic terms, like a community that experienced one major demographic transformation around 4,000 years ago, and then was left largely alone to develop within that foundation for the following 4 millennia. That is an extraordinary degree of continuity for a population living on a small island in one of the most contested maritime regions of the world. The British Isles were invaded, settled, raided, traded with, and culturally transformed repeatedly across recorded history. And yet the genetic core of the Western Irish population came through all of it essentially intact. The explanation is partly geography and partly culture reinforcing geography. The Atlantic coast of Ireland is not easy terrain. The land is rough, the weather is severe, the soils are thin. It was never the kind of landscape that attracted large-scale settlement by incoming populations, who had other options. The people already living there had adapted to it across generations and knew how to make it work. Newcomers had little reason to come and limited ability to displace communities that were embedded in the landscape in ways that gave them real advantages. Cultural patterns added another layer of protection. The Irish language, which survived in the West long after it was displaced elsewhere on the island, bound communities together in ways that reinforced their separateness from the English-speaking world that was reshaping the rest of Ireland from the 17th century onward. Marriage patterns stayed internal. Social networks stayed local. The cultural and linguistic isolation that preserved the Gaelic tradition in the western counties also preserved the genetic legacy of the communities that maintained that tradition. When the Irish DNA Atlas Project published its findings in 2017, one of the things that struck researchers most clearly was how well the genetic clusters they identified matched the historical geography of Irish cultural boundaries. The regions with the deepest Gaelic Irish cultural roots showed the strongest genetic continuity with ancient Irish ancestry. The regions most penetrated by later waves of settlement and cultural change showed the most diluted ancient ancestry. Culture and genetics had been moving together, reinforcing each other for a very long time. All of this converges on the same conclusion from multiple independent directions. The face that has puzzled outsiders for centuries, the one that does not match the expected Irish stereotype, the one that generated a whole mythology of Spanish sailors and Viking raiders and Norman knights to explain it, is not an import and never was. It is the native face of the island, the original face, the face that was there before the stereotypes were invented to describe it. The Black Irish look is what ancient European genetics preserved in a specific landscape, by a specific history of isolation, and continuity looks like in a living population. It is the visible signature of Neolithic pigmentation, surviving alongside Bronze Age ancestry, in communities that never got diluted enough to lose either. It is the result of 4,000 years of genetic stability in exactly the places where cultural and geographic conditions made that stability possible. When you look at that face on the western coast of Ireland, you are not looking at something that arrived from outside and stayed. You are looking at something that was there first and never fully left. You are looking at what survives when genetics and culture and geography all align to protect an ancient inheritance across a span of time long enough to make every romantic story about shipwrecks and raiders look like what they were all along. Recent, shallow. Stories invented to explain something that needed no outside explanation at all. Identity is more complicated than any single story can capture. The same island that sent red-haired faces across the world carried something older underneath all along. It was never hidden. It was never lost. It simply continued, generation by generation, in the west of Ireland, in the faces of people who had been looking out at the same Atlantic horizon for 4,000 years, and never needed an outside story to explain who they were. There is one piece of this picture that almost nobody mentions when they discuss the Black Irish, and it is perhaps the most quietly remarkable confirmation that the entire genetic story holds together the way the evidence says it does. It comes not from the people who stayed in Ireland, but from the people who left. The Irish diaspora is one of the largest in the world relative to the size of the home country, beginning with the waves of emigration that preceded the famine and accelerating dramatically through and after it. Millions of Irish people settled in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in Britain, and across the wider world. And wherever concentrated Irish emigrant communities settled, the full range of Irish genetic expression came with them. In the neighborhoods of Boston and New York and Chicago, where Irish immigrant communities established themselves in the 19th century, the same full spectrum of appearance that exists in Ireland appeared in America. Red hair and freckles sat beside black hair and pale skin in the same communities, the same parishes, the same extended family networks. The black Irish face crossed the Atlantic with everyone else because it was never a separate genetic category that had arrived separately. It was always part of the same population. Irish American communities developed their own version of the Black Irish mythology, disconnected from the geography of the Irish West, and therefore even more disconnected from the real explanation. In America, the Spanish Armada theory was especially persistent, perhaps because it framed a distinctive appearance as something distinguished and historically significant rather than simply different. The Romantic story gave families an identity that felt meaningful. The genetic reality was that they had simply inherited the ancient pigmentation alleles that their Western Irish ancestors had been carrying for 4,000 years, brought across the ocean in the same ships as everything else the emigrants carried with them. The diaspora evidence confirms something important. The Black Irish appearance is not a product of a specific local environment. It is not something that the landscape of the west of Ireland creates through some mechanism of exposure or climate. It is genetic. It travels. It appears in the children and grandchildren of Irish emigrants who have never seen the cliffs of Kerry or heard the Atlantic wind across the Connemara bog. The ancient alleles that produce it are inside the biology, and they express themselves wherever the biology goes. This matters because it closes the final door on any remaining environmental or coincidental explanation for the phenomenon. The face that appears in the west of Ireland is not there because of something particular about that place in the physical or climatic sense. It is there because the people in that place have maintained a specific genetic inheritance with a consistency that other parts of Ireland and other parts of Europe did not. And when those people moved, the inheritance moved with them. Modern consumer DNA testing has added one more dimension to this picture by allowing individuals to map their own genetic ancestry against population reference panels that include ancient DNA samples from archaeological sites. People of Irish descent who take these tests and who identify as Black Irish or come from family backgrounds associated with that appearance frequently show elevated levels of the early European farmer ancestry component compared to the Irish average. That component traces directly to the Neolithic farmers whose descendants were the dominant population of Ireland before the Bell-Beaker transformation and whose pigmentation genetics survived within the new demographic structure that transformation created. The test results are not perfectly clean, but the genetics and the visible traits consistently point in the same direction.